and asked him, who is this gentleman with white hair who sits with me at Asmara Palace? And I told him who I was, and so we met. We introduced each other. So at the end of our session at Asmara Palace, we went to go have breakfast. And from breakfast until lunch, he told me all about his life history, which is truly, truly amazing. This man has completely devoted his life to liberating his people. And I was crushed, as so many other people were, when the Yemenis grabbed him and handed him over to Ethiopia, knowing full well that he was condemned to death. So he went to face his fate in Ethiopia. Fortunately, Abiy turned up, and Abiy released not just Andargacho Tsoge, but tens of thousands of other people who are all fighting for their rights. So this is a new day. I don't think we should underestimate what Abiy is doing. You can talk all about statecraft and what needs to be done in terms of building lasting peace using institutions that are going to last forever. Well, my belief is that underneath all that, there's also a question of morality, there's a question of ethics, there's a question of deep faith. The words arki or mehret or salam are not part of the Wiyani vocabulary. That's why they couldn't make peace. They never have thought in terms of actually making peace or viewing the world through the eyes of the people with whom they are dealing. So he's new. He's new because he believes in things that the Oromo have always believed, by the way. That is to say, peacemaking, peace naga in Oromo is a big concept. It covers a great deal of territory. Partly it means peaceful transfer of power. That's not, we're not going to teach to Oromo about peaceful transfer of power because they have just handed over power for the 71st time. Every 8 years for the last 5.5 centuries, they have handed over power peacefully. Now, if you look at Ethiopian history, from Theodros until Wiyani, I do not believe there has been a single peaceful transfer of power. Really, therefore, almost all of them, except Zewditu, who inherited the throne and then was assassinated, and Lijiasu, who would have inherited the throne, he was also assassinated, and then Haile came to power, and he was assassinated by the Derg. And so, at what point has Ethiopia actually been able to transfer power peacefully, whatever the form of government it may be, monarchic or democratic? They have never have. Now that they are democratic, it is still a question, it was a question, whether or not peaceful transfer of power would be effected within the present democracy. And we know that Gabon Savat came into being because a democratic election was violated by the government of Ethiopia. So the Meles would still be around, and he would, like the Chinese president, declare himself president for life at some point. He would have done that. Unfortunately, things happened that prevented that from happening. So the idea of peace is not new to the Oromo, but let me say a couple of words about my two lives. One half of my life was spent among the Oromo, the other half was spent in Eritrea, in the new Eritrea, aside from my childhood. Now, why do I have two lives? Initially, I set out to study Eritrea. At 1961, I prepared a dissertation proposal, was funded, and I came to Ethiopia. I went to Ethiopia and asked to conduct research on Eritrea, on the customary laws of Eritrea, which I thought was really the truly democratic foundation of Eritrea. When I went to Ethiopia, the then minister, she wasn't the minister, he was the director, so the emperor held the portfolio for education. So Akalor was the director of education. I went to him to get permission to do my research. And he said, well, you're an Eritrean and you want to go back to Eritrea and do research? not on your life. Why? Because at this point, there are things happening in Eritrea that simply we would not allow you to go back there to do research, because the ELF had started its struggle to liberate Eritrea. So I was told to go back and redo my dissertation proposal, find some other place to do research. So I was completely at a loss. I didn't know much about Ethiopia, except the little that I learned as an undergraduate and as a student. Not much about Eritrea, about Ethiopia. So where else would I go to do research? Then I recalled in my childhood in 1940, Asmara was being bombarded by the Royal Air Force. Which is just prior to the liberation of Asmara. And the bombs that they were dropping in the Ferrovia, which is what they're trying to get, the train station, were dropping in our garden, which is 2 blocks away from the train station. And so my parents said, this is not safe for children, so they sent me and my siblings to Garami to live with my great-great-grandfather. And he is a pioneer, a revolutionary in his own right. He was one of the founders of the evangelical movement in Eritrea. He was one of 5 priests who decided that teaching religion in Ge'ez, a language which they didn't understand, which the congregation didn't understand, is really not truthful religion. So they decided to teach it in a language that people understand. And they didn't have the Bible, so they got one from Ethiopia, in Amharic, which had been rejected by the Ethiopian church because it's not written in Ge'ez. So they were condemned to death by Emperor Johannes for being heretics, and appeared before him and explained what they were doing, and he asked what are these people done that has brought them to before me, and they said they want to teach the Bible in Ba'alege Wangwa, vulgar languages, meaning Tigrinya and Amharic. And the emperor said, so you're saying that our language is vulgar? Send them back. These people have done nothing wrong. So later, the monks of the Oromo accused them again of being heretics, and then this time they were condemned to death, and then they fled from there and went to Umkullu to start their missionary activity, or their activity toward Bible translation, where they met an Oromo group who were being sold into slavery and were being shipped out of Eritrea via Massawa. Munzinga Pasha, the then governor of Massawa, set them free and handed them over to the Eritrean pioneers. So they welcomed them and taught them, began teaching them in Amharic using the Amharic Bible. So all this I heard from my great-grandfather, and he spoke very warmly about his experiences with the Oromo pioneers. So that was at the back of my mind when I decided to say, oh, if not Eritrea, then I'll have to study Oromo. What else could I do? And so that's how I started studying the Oromo. And that became my life's mission for the next 30 years. And I've written 3 books on them, many articles. At the time that I wrote the first book, 1973, very little was being said that was positive about the Oromo. There's a lot that was really horrible, demeaning that was being said about the Oromo. And I felt that I know the Oromo. I've had many friends at Makana Jesus and in school, at Makana school. They are a wonderful people. and that the image that was being presented was being done to justify the regime that was in power, which claims that it's not Oromo, it's Amhara. And it turns out that Emperor Haile Selassie actually goes to Eritrea to celebrate Eritrea to Bishoftu. And I went to see that ceremony, and what he does is he arrives there in the afternoon, the day before Eritrea, and watches the whole ceremony with binoculars, and then the night after, he and the clergy and the nobility go into the lake region under a tree and celebrate Eritrea on their own. Now, what is this? This is a kind of a backup religion, which if the Christian God fails you, then you have another God to go back to. That seems to be how they were operating. In other words, there was a dualism, a pretended identity, which always denies the Oromo component. And so this is why I decided to expose as much of the wealth of Oromo culture as I could, and I spent a great deal of time studying that firsthand. I lived for 5 years among the Oromo of Ethiopia and Eritrea, and have just finished rewriting my first book, but adding to it the work that's been done during the last 45 years, and updating all of it. In the meantime, in addition to gadaa, the democratic political system of the Oromo, in which people are elected every 8 years without fail, for 550 years. But on top of that, also they have a legislative body that meets once every 8 years and makes laws and makes constitutions. They even make constitutional laws that change the nature of their institutions. They have done that twice in their history. So when we see an Oromo elected to power, and he and his predecessor hug each other and pass on power, this is a new day. This has never happened before. In other words, the transfer of power has always been a violent event. It's very likely that Emperor Haile Selassie had Emperor Zewditu assassinated. We don't know for sure, but we know from an alkash. Alkash are the women who help the family to mourn. So she sings on their behalf. And so she said, "As Minilik ድመት አይወዳቸው ንግስት ዘውዲቱን አነር ገደላቸው." Aner is the word for wild cat. So ድመት አይወዳቸው አነር ገደላቸው, wild cat ገደላቸው ማለት ነው። ግን ሁለተኛው ትርጉሙ ግን ምንድነው? Hanner is the name of the Swedish medical doctor who was the doctor of the royal family. So basically she was saying that he injected them with poison. She fled and went to a place where they couldn't find her, and they discovered later that what she had said was that Emperor Haile Selassie had actually assassinated Zewditu in order to gain power. So peaceful transfer of power that we saw happening in Ethiopia is a product of Oromo culture, directly. That's not the only thing. There's another thing that they did, which was I saw, which was amazing. The elders came to Abiy and President Isaias, and they asked them to squat down, sit down, and they started blessing them. And the blessing can go on for quite some time. You know, this is an integral part of Oromo culture. Blessing is a way of making peace. There is no peace without blessing. There is no peace without acknowledgement of the things that you have done that are terrible. There can be no peace. So Nuzaze in our religions, in Christian religion, exists in Oromo culture as a historic phenomenon. You have to accept your sins before you can be either punished or set free, but under the observation of your community. So that happened. The third thing that happened was people on horseback galloping at full speed, accompanying the retinue of President Isaias as he was traveling into Addis Ababa, which is extraordinary, at full gallop. this is part of Oromo history. Oromo history came about as a result of a cavalry which they had, which was at the head of all their campaigns. They came to highland Ethiopia, to Shoa, on horseback. And they captured virtually all the territories that they could reach on horseback, except the very mountainous regions that are cliffs where the horse cannot function properly, or densely cultivated areas like Jimma and further south, which are so intensively cultivated that there's no room for livestock and for horses. So they avoided those. Or they adopted the way of life of those people in Jimma, for instance. They adopted their way of life, gave up horses, and they started cultivating and so on. So horsemanship are big deals in Oromo culture. I, as a student, used to go to Meskel celebrations in Jan Meda. Those of you who've been to Ethiopia know what I'm talking about. Jan Meda Meskel is celebrated every year. In those celebrations, the Tunkat celebrations, in those celebrations there's always a game of gooks on horseback, where Shoan Oromo youth ride horses chasing each other with clubs at full gallop. And I thought, this is extraordinary. This is something that I had never experienced. But this is part of the history of the cavalry and of horsemanship in their lives. So the Oromo respect the horse greatly. If you kill a horse, the price you pay is the price of human life. Gar, mulu gar is if you kill a female or pregnant horse, the price is unlimited. And so the only thing you can do is just leave the country and leave some other place. So what we saw, the horse riders that we saw in the celebrations, is again yet another part of Oromo history, which was basically not fully understood. We see it, as I did, in Tunkat celebrations, but outside of that, we don't know to what extent horses and horsemanship has been an integral part of Oromo history. So these are the few sort of prefatory remarks I wanted to make to relate to things that have been said already here. But my presentation goes more directly into the research I conducted in Eritrea. I was in Eritrea from 1984, when I went to Meda, 1998 again, 1988, sorry, again. And then from then, 1991, I went to Eritrea, and for 25 years I've been doing research all that time, including the 3 years of the Wayane War. Each year was spent deeply involved in defending the rights of the victims of war. And so all of that is part of the background that I want to talk about here, because if we are going to make peace, then we'd better understand how we got here. We better understand how much damage was done during the Wayane War. The Wayane War is exceptional. It's not like previous wars in Ethiopia. They did things that nobody else did. They did more cruel, more vicious things than anybody else did. I'll give you some examples. There are many, many examples. Desecrating churches and mosques, actually defiling them by having sexual intercourse with prostitutes in the church and then leaving condoms scattered about in a mosque that I saw in Hajar. Desecrating the graves of Tegadelti. Some of the Tegadelti may have died actually fighting on behalf of Tigray. Yet they go and desecrate the grave. Then, when I was in Basura, I discovered that something had happened during the occupation of Wayane occupied Basura for a couple of years. And at that time, for more than a year, the soldiers were gang raping Muslim Saho women on Basara Mountain on a daily basis. And they were doing it in groups of 7, and they were told not to take their firearms when they go to do this, they'll just carry daggers. And then they would gang rape the women in the presence of their children and their husbands. To me, this was horrendous. Why? I don't remember. A lot of cruelty has been committed by Ethiopians who are fighting wars, but nothing like this has ever been documented, ever. So things happened. By the way, I took Mama Amina, who was the woman who agreed to testify about this, to UNICEF. I took her to Sweden, and she testified before UNICEF. And the wife of Olof Palme, the assassinated president of Sweden, she is the spokesperson of UNICEF. She fell in love with Mama Amina and took her around all over Sweden, heavily draped in warm clothes because we arrived there in dead winter with Sweden completely covered in snow. So anyway, she spoke out on behalf of women who have been victimized in this fashion, so on. So many instances of cruelties that were committed by Wayane. Now, so who incidentally, when that war was in progress, where was the power, the drive behind that coming from? I don't think it came from all of Tigray. It was part of Tigray that was completely devoted to the idea of reconquering Eritrea. Why reconquering? Because a few decades earlier, Ras Alula was the governor of Eritrea. And Ras Alula, there are people who call themselves the Alula today. Why the Alula? What's the big deal? It is the notion that we governed Eritrea, and just to a certain extent they expect that is their right, that they are destined to govern Eritrea. So when the opportunity came up to fight the war with Eritrea, they went into it with a passion that was extraordinary. And not all of them shared that passion, by the way. I think Meles Zenawi and his crowd were not all that eager to go to war, and were suspected of being sympathetic to Eritrea, partly because Meles was half Eritrean. And so they threatened him. When threatened, he responded by started saying really terrible things about Eritrea and being as violent as they are, in order to save his skin, basically. And so this is the deep hostility. I divide Tigray into 2, East and West. And East and West are 2 completely different things in my mind, from my experiences. Western Tigray, Shire especially, is separated from Eritrea by the Mereb. So there's no question of friction about the border. There's no fence pushing, as happens on the Agame side all the time. You know, the Agame side, the area they call Gulomokheda, is the places where throughout history there has been friction about the border communities, constantly. And the Eritreans are arm themselves and fight to maintain their plots of land, their homes and their properties and so on. So something happened on the eastern side of Tigray that has never happened in any other part of Ethiopia. That is the successful winning over of part of the Saho nation called Erob and making them part of Tigray. And this was a campaign that lasted for decades. It was a very calculated calculated job. It started with Asimba, the massacre of the leaders of Europe. You know, the Europe were converted to Catholicism in 1840, before Catholicism saw any other part of Ethiopia, way, way back. And so for generations they had been educated. They had an educated class, and they wiped out the entire educated class in one go, the Wiyane did. 22 people were killed, among them were PhDs and doctors. The rest of them fled. The rest of the educated Europe fled and took refuge in Sana'a, and I interviewed them in Sana'a, and they've written to me profuse life histories to say how they were driven out of their country. Thereafter, the attempt to win over Europe didn't start with Asimba. It started decades before that, by the ruling house of Agame. They are called Shum Agame. That's the title, their traditional title. Shum Agame and the Europe nobility, if you can call them that, have invented a genealogy that is a common genealogy of the two peoples. That is to say, to show that the Europe and the Agame have a common descent. Europe's are Saho, they don't even speak the Grinya, but here we are creating a genealogy that says that they are of common descent with the royal house, the quasi-royal house of Agame. So after Asimba, so what happens is they proceed to give Europe everything that they could hope for. I mean, they gave them facilities, they gave them wealth, they built palaces for the villas and palaces for the bishops of Europe and so on. So when we came to have our referendum, an issue arose. Would the Europe be allowed to vote? They are Eritreans, like Eritreans everywhere, they should be allowed to vote. Wiyane insisted that there should be no voting booths for the referendum in Europe. And there are many Europes, fighters and others, who are deeply wounded by the fact that Eritreans in every part of the world, wherever they are, including Ethiopia, were voted in the referendum except the Europe. That is a wound that really is very difficult for them to forget. And so I suggest that we do a bit of rethinking of our history to see what it is that was done during the war, and if we are going to be able to heal the wounds that were created by the war, then one has to begin to recognize and acknowledge what was done. In other words, there can be no peace unless the two parties are fully willing and fully prepared to acknowledge what it is that they've done. This was done in South Africa, this was done in Rwanda. The two parties in the genocide in Rwanda came together to say, both of us must admit what it is that we have done that is so terrible to the other, and once the admission has taken place, then the peacemaking can go on. But if you are in the business of sweeping history under the rug, covering up all the terrible things that, when I give presentations in conventions like this one, and describe the fact that there was gang raping of women that took place in Basura, my Ethiopian colleagues simply said, my goodness, you're making all this up. It doesn't happen. Never happened, you know. So if you deny all the things that were done, there's no way that peace can be meaningful to the people who are the victims of that activity. And so if I begin to hear from the Tigrayan side some admission of the terrible things that they did during that war, then perhaps there is room for making peace. Without that, I don't think peace will be real. Forget about whether it will be lasting or not, because lasting or not is a matter of institutions that are created that may facilitate the continued existence of the relationship. But beyond that, there is a matter of trust that has to be created between the two peoples. Why is it that we are so fascinated by Abiy? Because he really starts with the premise that there is something good in human beings, and he goes searching for it, and he finds it, Our response to Abiy was tremendous. It was extraordinary. And so was the Ethiopian response to Isaias. Up to that point, I don't think they ever really thought of Isaias as being in any way a friend. And all of a sudden, there's this profusion of sentiment that's expressed by Ethiopians. Why? Because here's a leader who has bypassed all the shenanigans of the old state and gone ahead and communicated directly to people on a human-to-human, conscious-to-conscious level. And that works. That does amazing things. The structure building can go later. And as far as the structure building is concerned, there are many things that are going to come up as we proceed to improve relations with Ethiopia. One is the question of access to the sea. That is, talk about anything that you want, but if that issue is not resolved, then the Ethiopians will not give us peace. And so, access to the sea doesn't mean the same thing to all Ethiopians. As far as Gondar, North Gondar, and Tigray are concerned, the only access to the sea is through Massawa, not through Assab. As far as the rest of Ethiopia is concerned, Assab or Djibouti or Mombasa, they have plenty of choices. For us to begin to think about access to the sea, it has to be in relation to North Ethiopia and Tigray on the one hand, and the rest of Ethiopia on the other hand. The Tigrayans, so far, I don't think they have made any significant move to say they're going to go along with the proposal that's been made by Dr. Abiy. The fact that Hadbadem is going to be handed over to Eritrea, which was Eritrean to begin with, is something that is not acceptable to many, and there are many that are complaining about that. As far as the armed services are concerned, I heard Dr. Abiy addressing the generals in Ethiopia recently, and he was lecturing them at great length about how to reform the armed forces. And I don't think he'll have any difficulty in persuading them to follow through with the system that he's proposing, and at the same time he's retiring some of them and accusing others of corruption and getting rid of them that way, and so on. One way or another, I think probably Abiy will have his say. But I agree that the armed forces, if that's not entirely under the control of the Prime Minister and the central government, it can be a major source of problems. Currency is going to be another problem. Our currency is not traded. The exchange rate is fixed. Their currency is traded, and it changes day by day. So what currency do you use to trade with each other? That's the question. Do you use dollars? Do you use cryptocurrency? Or do you use something else to do the trading? And so on. So there are many issues like that that has to be re-examined. The most important, from my perspective, issue that has to be re-examined is the plight of all the villages along the Ethiopia-Eritrea border, which were never part of the Ethiopia-Eritrea Border Commission's research work. the maps that they prepared are maps of the physical environment. Rivers, towns they've included, streams, and so on. But it's a physical map. It's not a map of human geography. They ignored human geography completely. So when I was after the end of the war, I was traveling all around the border area, and I succeeded in mapping out the whole border region and placing all the villages on a map. The president saw that map. Somehow it reached the office of the president, and President Isaias asked who made this map, and they told him Asmarom, and so he said call him up, and so I was summoned and asked to hand over all the maps. He said this is very dangerous because if this falls in the hands of Wiyane, they can use this very effectively, and I agreed. So they were kept under lock and key since then until now. And my hope is that I'll go back to working with those maps again to see which villages are actually on which part of the boundary. We don't know that. And so at the time that this happened, Kassai was governor of Zowadobu, and he saw my map and he said, please, please, please let me have this map. And so I said, well, with the consent of the office of the president, you can have one. So I gave him one. Because they were traveling along the border, not knowing when they're actually stepping on territory that may actually be in the hands of the Wiyane. Very dangerous stuff. So in any case, the plight of all those villages, a lot of villages, two things have happened with regard to the border. On the Sorona side, a big chunk of territory was taken from Tigray and given to Eritrea. Okay? Besides the town of Sorona, everything north of the Belasa River was handed over to Ethiopia. That's very damaging for Eritrea, but it was done. On the Gulomaka side, in Agame, a big chunk of territory was taken from Tigray and handed over to Eritrea. When I discussed that with Kassai, he said, why don't we trade those two pieces of territory and solve the problem that way? We may be able to do that if there is peace that is actually accomplished. But in the meantime, what was happening was that Wiyane was doing a lot of fake research to say that the border was drawn in such a way that it was splitting villages. It was separating churches from their congregations and so on. But they produced hundreds of piddly pieces of information to show that the boundary ignored all these important realities. What was their purpose? Their purpose was to say that the boundary is not valid. So we should renegotiate the boundary. My purpose is not that. My purpose is to see what happened to those people, how many people have lost their land, their wrist on either side, and have settled on the other side of the territory. They are now either Eritreans without their choice or Ethiopians without their choice. And so I think one of the important things for the boundary communities is to consider their right of return, if they wish to return, or to their right to get citizenship in the territory that they have now been assigned to. So there's a lot of important key issues of risk and of citizenship that is going to be part of the negotiations that will have to be conducted. So I have ad-libbed through my speech without looking at my PowerPoint presentation, so we'll forget it.